Aloha, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Malia. Thank you, Michael, for. Okay, great. Thank you. Right. Thank you so much. All right, well, aloha and welcome, everyone. My name is Claudine Allen. I'm a lead Native Hawaiian program specialist in the HUD Honolulu office. And so I work very closely with the Department of Hawaiian Homeland's NHHBG staff to implement the NHHBG funds that are awarded to DHHL to provide affordable housing opportunities to Native Hawaiian families on Hawaiian homelands. Um, my role here today is to explain the, the federal environmental review requirements that the Department of Hawaiian Homelands is subject to because of their role in being the grant recipient of the NHHBG funds. And so normally HUD does a very comprehensive 3 full-day training session to explain the environmental review requirements in much depth. Today, my goal is to give you just a broad overview, mostly of the process, and to explain some of the nuances of the steps within the process. So with that, we'll get started. Oh, sure. Malia asked me to let everyone know that this session is being recorded. So if folks weren't able to join, or if you want to revisit to go over the material that was presented, you'll have that opportunity. Thank you, Michael. So again, today we'll be doing a brief overview of the environmental review process and some of the requirements applicable to the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program. I will use the terms Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant, the acronym NHHBG. NHHBG is the acronym for the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, which is the legislation that authorizes the NHHBG program. So I'll use those terms interchangeably when referring to the grant program. Mahalo. All right, so today's objective is to provide a basic instruction for carrying out the federal environmental review responsibilities and to discuss some key steps in the environmental review process under the regulation of 24 CFR Part 58. Okay, next slide. So this is an outline of the sections of information that I plan to go over. So we'll do a general overview. I'll describe the different levels of environmental review. We're also going to talk about how to document the environmental review record. Some of the requirements that we have with regard to doing notice of publications. And then when the Department of Hawaiian Homelands has to submit a request for release of funds to HUD, and then some additional environmental guidance. All right, so let's get started with the general overview and the regulatory structure of the environmental review requirements. So we have a statute and regulation that governs the NHHBG program. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, NHHBG, or the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, specifically Title 8 of NHHBG is what authorizes the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program. And in Section 806 of NHHBG is where you'll find the statutory environmental review requirements for the program. The HUD regulation to implement this statute is found in the Code of Federal Regulations at Title 24, Part 1006. Section 1006.350 is where you'll find the regulatory environmental review requirements. So specifically, Section 806B of NHHBG discusses the environmental review procedure. So basically what it says is DHHL takes on the responsibility of ensuring that the environmental review requirements are met and taking on the responsibility to make the determinations and decisions in moving forward with projects that are funded with the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant. And under certain circumstances, DHHL must wait for HUD to authorize the release of funds before the funds can be committed to a project for that project to proceed. And so the regulation that implements that part of the statute says that no funds may be committed to a grant activity or project before the completion of the environmental review and approval of the request for release of funds and the related certification that DHHL makes to HUD, except as authorized. And so, again, very specific to making sure that we comply with the environmental review requirements, obtain the necessary approvals before any funds are committed to the project. And I'm going to stress this periodically throughout the presentation because it's a very, very important part of the requirement. I do have a note at the bottom here that requesting a bid for work is not necessarily considered a choice limiting action. So in other words, DHHL could go out for a request for bid for work before all of the environmental review requirements are complete, provided that the bid allows the responsible entity, which is Department of Hawaiian Homelands, to cancel or reject the project if the environmental review reveals that the site is not suitable for the use intended. Okay, so there's a little bit of a leeway there, but still we want to make sure we get the environmental review process completed first. All right, so goals of the environmental review is to ensure that the environmental impacts of federal actions are taken into account. So whenever federal funds are intended to be used for a project, that becomes a federal action. And also to ensure that environmental concerns are identified and addressed before the project is undertaken. Continuing on with goals, another goal of the environmental review is to ensure that we protect residents, neighborhoods, communities, and the communities surrounding the project, to enhance and preserve cultural and natural resources whenever possible, and to allow for public input in the decision-making during the environmental review process. And these are also the goals of NEPA. So what is NEPA? NEPA is an acronym that stands for the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, and it's the basic national charter for protection of the environment. NEPA also established the Council on Environmental Quality, which is in the Executive Office of the President. This council coordinates federal environmental efforts in the United States and works with agencies on the development of environmental and energy policies and initiatives. So each federal agency has its own set of regulations to implement the NEPA law. And then as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention this, but HUD's regulations to implement NEPA are at 24 CFR Part 50 and Part 58. Part 50 is the regulations for when HUD is responsible for carrying out the environmental review requirements. And Part 58 is the regulation that covers the responsible entities or the HUD federal grantees who are responsible for carrying out the environmental responsibilities. So NEPA also ensures that environmental information is made available to public officials and citizens before decisions are made and before actions are taken. So again, that before is being strongly stressed here. And NEPA applies to all proposals for federal actions that have the potential to affect the quality of the human environment. Federal actions include federal funding for grants, loan guarantees, grant funds that end up being what we call program income, and et cetera. There's no trigger level for these requirements. All levels of funding are required. Right, next slide. So let's get started with some of the basics as far as the environmental review requirements applicable to the NHHBG program. So as I did mention earlier, under 24 CFR Part 58, in this case, the NHHBG recipient or the Department of Hawaiian Homelands assumes the responsibility for environmental review. So every penny of NHHBG funds awarded to DHHL must be covered by an environmental review. If DHHL intends to use funds for any activity in a project, DHHL must complete the environmental review process under Part 58 for all planned activities in that project, again, before committing HUD and non-HUD funds for any activity in the project. So regardless if you're just using $1 of NHHBG funds and the rest of the project is funded by other funding sources, it triggers the NHHBG environmental review requirements. Now, when I get into the part of the presentation where I'm going to explain the different levels of environmental review, the different levels are determined by the type of activities that would be carried out as part of the project. So when we talk about exempt activities, it's activities that are within that level, that certain level of environmental review. We're not talking about any exemption from the environmental review requirements, okay? So exempt activities such as administrative and management activities, and some categorically excluded activities, again, another level of environmental review, do not require a request for release of funds to be submitted to HUD and for HUD to approve the request. In those instances, though, DHHL must document its determination and comply with applicable requirements in another section of the environmental regulation at 58.6 before the funds are committed and expended for the activity. So I know this is just a lot of words right now, and I'll try to break this down and explain this a little further as we get through the presentation. Okay, next. Let me explain some key environmental review terms, which I think may be helpful as we get through the presentation. The responsible entity, as I mentioned, is the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. The recipient is also the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. They are the recipient of the NHHBG grant from HUD. And then another term is participants, certifying officer, ONAP point of contact, and the environmental review record. So let me explain a little bit further on each term as we get to the next slide. The responsible entity, again, the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, assumes federal responsibility for compliance with NEPA and related laws and authority. So DHHL will be carrying out, or its consultants will be helping DHHL carry out all of the environmental review responsibilities. Next. The responsible entity assumes responsibility for the environmental review, conducting the environmental review, the environmental compliance review. If project conditions change and there needs to be a re-evaluation of the environmental findings, DHHL must ensure that is done. DHHL is responsible for the environmental decision-making. So they are legally responsible for the content of the environmental review and any findings. So there are going to be points within the process where DHHL will have to do some decision-making on whether they're going to move forward with the project or not. And if they move forward, there will be some contingency or condition mitigation measures that may need to be carried out. So DHHL will be making decisions on those levels as well. And then of course, for the environmental action and implementing mitigation measures, if applicable, in order to carry the project out. The responsible entity obviously must have the technical capacity and administrative capability to conduct the environmental review. So that could be capacity in-house or through outside sources, through partnerships with consultants. And so we just want to make sure that DHHL in that regard has the capacity it needs to carry out this responsibility. The recipient of the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant, of course, is the Department of Hawaiian Homeland. So DHHL is the recipient. Now, participants refers to subrecipients or service providers that DHHL may contract with to help DHHL carry out the NHHBG funded projects. Okay, so subrecipients and service providers of NHHBG funds, this could include public or private nonprofit or for-profit organizations, as well as their contractors. In these instances, the subrecipient or the service provider, if DHHL requires them to participate in getting the environmental review done, then these participants must supply DHHL with all available and relevant information that DHHL requests. They may also be asked to help DHHL carry out any mitigation measures that are identified for the project. And it's very important for these subrecipients and service providers, subcontractors, to not commit or expend NHHBG funds or any other funds for the project until notified by DHHL. And also to not acquire, rehabilitate, convert, lease, to carry out any activities related to the project until given the go-ahead by DHHL. Another key term is a certifying officer. And this person assumes the role of responsible federal official. So remember I said that under HUD's regulation for environmental review requirements, we have the HUD side, where HUD is the responsible entity for carrying out environmental reviews. In this case, under Part 58, DHHL is that responsible entity. And so DHHL's certifying officer is the director or the chairperson of the commission. And so it is he who assumes the role of responsible federal official and has the legal capacity to carry out NEPA and Part 58 responsibilities. He also accepts the jurisdiction of the federal courts for the responsible entity in any environmental matters. So if DHHL is challenged in court on any actions that they take with regard to environmental review, then the certifying officer has the role to accept that jurisdiction to respond. The ONAP point of contact, and I'll explain, ONAP stands for Office of Native American Programs. That is the office within HUD for which I work. And so I am DHHL's ONAP point of contact to offer technical assistance, training, and to help DHHL in any way for it to carry out its environmental review responsibilities. So we can provide guidance on the rules and regulations, help facilitate putting DHHL in contact with other agencies as necessary, and then provide any type of assistance with filling out the appropriate forms and gathering the necessary documentation to carry out DHHL's responsibility. Now this term, environmental review record, which we use the acronym ERR. Sometimes I hear folks use the term ERR interchangeably with the actual environmental review. The ERR, or the environmental review record, is actually the written record that demonstrates that environmental review has been done for the project. Okay, so the environmental review itself is the process of doing the environmental review and analysis to comply with NEPA and the other federal regulatory requirements. The ERR is actually the written record to document all of the analysis and conclusions and findings, evidence that the HUD authorized the release of funds. All of that is included within the written record of the environmental review record. So let's get started and talk a little bit more about the environmental review process under Part 58. So again, this is such an important point about the limits on activities prior to clearance. So here at this section, in Part 58, 58.22, it says that neither a recipient nor any participant in the development process. So DHHL, its subrecipients, its service providers, none of these may commit HUD funds and non-HUD funds on any activity or project until HUD has approved DHHL's request for release of funds and DHHL has made the appropriate certification, unless the activity is exempt or categorically excluded. So I did explain this in an earlier slide, but again, it's such an important point. And unfortunately, DHHL has experienced the consequence in one situation where this was not done. And so I can't stress enough how important it is to ensure that this requirement is followed so as not to affect the ability to move forward in using NHHBG funds for a project, because that is the ultimate consequence. If this is not followed, it's actually considered a statutory violation, which is not something that can be waived. As to any statutory violation, unfortunately, has serious consequences that could lead to not being able to move forward in using NHHBG funds for a project. It would make that project ineligible for NHHBG assistance. Under the Part 58 regulation, we encourage responsible entities to do project aggregation. And so depending on the type of activities that are involved in the project, there may be an opportunity to aggregate the activities under 3 different types of aggregation. And so we do require the responsible entities to group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities that are related either on a geographical or functional basis or considered logical parts of a composite of contemplated actions. So the different types of aggregation could be functional aggregation, geographic aggregation, or multi-year aggregation. Just as a side note here, our HUD General Counsel has determined that if the only source of HUD assistance is going to be used for exempt activities, then aggregation does not apply. But I'm going to say with the type of projects that the Department of Hawaiian Homelands executes, this will probably never be the case. All right, so let's talk about functional aggregation. This applies when a specific type of activity takes place in several separate locales or jurisdictions. And so what you would do is a group review for activities that will serve the same function and have the same potential impact regardless of the site. So one example of this would be water system improvements. That type of activity involves certain type of work, regardless of whether you're going to do it here or on the other side of the island. So this could be an example of functional aggregation. The next type of aggregation is called geographic aggregation, and it's used to evaluate a mix of dissimilar but related activities to be concentrated in a fairly specific geographic area. So the goal is to assess the cumulative effect of all planned activities. So an example of this would be combining water, sewer, street improvements, and maybe even some economic development activities such as equipment purchase and inventory financing. So you would aggregate these different activities that are going to be done in one particular area. Okay. Then the multi-year aggregation is used when the project consists of a series of activities that will be implemented over a time period of 2 or more years. And so, for example, maybe in year 1, DHHL might acquire land to build housing units. In ideally, right, year 2, do site development and infrastructure. And then ideally in year 3, move forward with construction of single family housing. So again, the idea is that this is a long range, long-term project, and you're aggregating the activities that will take place over a multi-year period. Now, once the project scope is identified, then DHHL would need to determine the level of environmental review that's required for the project, right? So the type of activity or group of activities is what's going to identify your project scope that's proposed for the project. That will dictate the level of environmental review that must be completed. So it should be determined on all the activities that would be part of the project. Again, project aggregation, right? Keeping that in mind. The activity that requires the highest level of environmental review is what will determine the level of environmental review that's required to be completed for the project. So now let's start talking about the different levels of environmental review. These are the different levels, starting off with the level that takes the least amount of time to complete would be your category of exempt activities. The next higher level of environmental review is what we call categorical exclusions. And there are two parts, two different types of categorical exclusions. There are categorically excluded activities that are called what we call subject to 58.5. And these are the other federally regulated requirements under NEPA. And then the other categorical exclusion category would be those activities that are not subject to those additional regulatory requirements. The next higher level of environmental review is called an environmental assessment. And then in HUD's tier of environmental levels, the highest level of environmental review is the environmental impact statement. So I do want to say at this point, and I think it's really in line with the different training sessions that will be presented today. Obviously, this morning I'm presenting the federal environmental review requirements. Later in the day, the state environmental review requirements will be presented and discussed. So I wanted to make this point here that the terminology that is used in the federal environmental review requirements do not necessarily align with the terminology used in the state process. So what we call an environmental impact statement is considered our highest level of environmental review. That does not mean the same thing in the state environmental review process. I'm seeing heads nodding, so you agree and understand. Very good. Okay. So for the level of exempt activities, these are they're called exempt because they're exempt from preparing what we call an environmental assessment or an EIS and the related laws and authorities in 58.5. So again, not exempt from environmental review, it's just a certain group of activities that fall under this level of environmental review under Part 58. So these would be activities which by their nature are unlikely to have environmental effects. So some examples of exempt activities would be doing the actual environmental review itself and related studies to carry out the environmental review. Any type of administrative and management activities to carry out that project. Public services that would not have a physical impact or result in physical changes to the environment. So doing such activities that are concerned with helping people find employment, doing activities that to prevent crime, promote childcare, those sort of public services. The purchase of insurance and tools is considered exempt activities. Doing the engineering and design for a project is another exempt activity. And then of course, carrying out technical assistance and training. So these are all examples of exempt activities. Okay, next. So as I mentioned, we have these different levels of environmental review, and then each environmental review has to have an environmental review record. So to document the exempt level of environmental review, HUD, well, let me back up. On this website here where you see this link, HUD has a list of formats and samples that are available for our responsible entities to utilize. And so we have a different format and sample that is prepared depending on the level of environmental review. So by clicking on this link, you'll find the HUD recommended format to document the environmental review record for exempt activities. So although exempt activities are not subject to the related laws and authorities required under NEPA, every level of environmental review must document compliance with these other requirements found at section 58.6. Okay, so that will apply to every level of environmental review. For this level of environmental review, there is no requirement for DHHL to submit a request for release of funds and certification to HUD. And so once this level of environmental review is documented using this recommended format and it's been signed off by the appropriate person at DHHL, your environmental review is complete for this level of environmental review. This is just a snippet of that HUD recommended format to document this exempt level of environmental review. So this is just a sample. The next level of environmental review is for categorical exclusions. So it's a higher level of environmental review than the exempt activities, but it's for activities that do not require the next higher level of environmental assessment or EIS under NEPA, unless it's an extraordinary circumstance, but we'll leave that to the side. So again, as I mentioned, there are two groups of categorical exclusions, and we separate them by saying categorically excluded subject to 58.5 or categorically excluded not subject to 58.5. So for the categorical exclusions that are subject to 58.5, these must demonstrate compliance with the federal laws and authorities that are cited at 58.5 in the regulation. And some examples of these activities that would fall under this level of environmental review would be the acquisition, repair, improvement, reconstruction, rehabilitation of public facilities. And it goes on, it goes into detail. So it's not my intent to give you a very thorough explanation of all of the different types of activities for each level of environmental review, but know that the regulation outlines the example of activities that would justify the different levels of environmental review. So just know that this level of environmental review is a little bit higher level because it involves more activity that could have an impact on the environment and thus is subject to the federal laws and authorities at 58.5. So essentially any type of construction action, rehabilitation, disturbing of the ground will typically fall under this category if you're not constructing more than 4 units. Okay, that's the best way for me to sum it up. And again, we have a HUD recommended format on how to document the environmental review record for this level of environmental review. So that would be the same link that you can obtain that sample. This is a snippet of that document. So it goes into a lot more detail from the first example that we saw under the first level of environmental review. So much more analysis is involved to evaluate different areas of the environment to document this record. So after completing this HUD recommended format to demonstrate the analysis of this level of environmental review, well, let me back up. By completing, I'm sorry, let's go back. Thank you, Michael. So when completing this the different areas of analysis, all the different factors that need to be evaluated as part of the environmental review, there's going to be a section in the documentation where the reviewer will need to indicate if there's any formal compliance steps or mitigation required for that particular factor that's being evaluated. So for example, if there is an area designated as a wetland in or near the project, and if it requires some sort of consultation with the appropriate authorizing federal agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, right? Then you would check off yes in that box. So that means there's some sort of consultation or potentially mitigation that would be required. And so that's what we mean by, thank you. And so that's what we mean by invoking that particular regulatory requirement. And so if none of those additional statutes or federal requirements are invoked, and you get a pretty clean analysis, technically your project can be considered an exempt activity. But you won't know that until going through the full analysis of all the different environmental factors, okay? So what I'm trying to explain is that this is a higher level, the type of activities triggers a higher level of environmental review. And if any of these other federal statutes or requirements are invoked, then DHHO will need to make a determination. Okay, go to the next slide. And DHHO will have to determine either whether the project can convert to exempt, and if not, if it cannot convert to exempt because either some type of consultation or mitigation requirements must be carried out, then DHHO will have to submit a request for release of funds from HUD before it is able to commit funds to the project to move this project forward. Okay, and then this is the where the red arrow is the area of the HUD recommended format where DHHO will have to document that decision making related to the project under this level of environmental review. Okay, next. So the required documentation, this continues on with what documentation must be included in the environmental review. So you're going to have your actual environmental review analysis. If it requires submitting a request for release of funds to HUD, there's also a public notification that must be published as part of that process. So your public notice, your request for release of funds to HUD, and then HUD's response, which hopefully would be an authority to authorize DHHO to use grant funds. All of that documentation would need to be collected and included in the environmental review record. And then once that authority is received from HUD, then DHHO can move forward with committing funds to the project. Okay, next, please. Now, this other type of categorical exclusion would be activities that are not subject to 58.5. So this level of environmental review is actually very similar to the exempt activities level of environmental review. It's just a matter of documenting the ERR, the environmental review record, that this level of environmental review is triggered, completing these are some of the examples of activities. So it's not considered exempt, but they're activities that wouldn't necessarily create an impact on the environment. So some examples of these activities would be tenant-based rental assistance, supportive services being provided as part of a housing project, operating costs such as maintenance, security, and operation, and other incidental costs for operating a project, and activities to assist homebuyers to purchase an existing dwelling or dwelling units that are under construction, which would be like down payment and closing costs. Okay, these would be the type of activities under this level of environmental review. Okay. And then just again, continuing on with more examples of activities under this level, we can go to the next slide. So as I was starting to say, you would get the way to document the ERR would be getting the format from the website, and it's very similar to the documentation required under the exempt activities level of environmental review. And so it's basically just filling out the environmental review form, DHHO signing off on it, and the environmental review is done. There's no requirement to request a release of funds from HUD under the categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5 level of environmental review. Okay, next please. Um, so even though it's been determined that it's a categorically excluded level of environmental review, if there are extraordinary circumstances related to the project, that could possibly bump this project up to a slightly higher level of environmental review. And what we define as extraordinary circumstances would be a situation in which an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement is not normally required, but due to unusual conditions, the EA or EIS is appropriate. So these would be actions that are unique without precedence, actions that are substantially similar to those that normally require an EIS, actions likely to alter existing HUD policy or mandates, or actions that due to unusual physical conditions on the site or in the vicinity have the potential for a significant impact on the environment. I have never seen any of DHHL's projects fall into this situation, luckily, thankfully, but just know that the regulation allows for this type of situation if it were to occur. So the next higher level of an environmental review under the federal requirements is the environmental assessment. So basically, if a project is not exempt or categorically excluded, and it doesn't require an EIS, then DHHL must prepare an environmental assessment. And so the activities that are generally covered by an environmental assessment would be new construction of 5 units or more, major rehabilitation activities, that is rehabilitation that exceeds the limits for categorical exclusion. So when you read into the details of the regulation where it describes the difference between how to determine the difference between the different levels of environmental review, it gets into all those details so that it will help the responsible entity make the appropriate determination of which level of environmental review fits the project. Any type of land acquisition for housing development, where the land, if you're buying vacant land and you're intending to use it for housing development, it's not going to remain vacant, that triggers an EA. Or any type of conversion of one type of land use to another, that also triggers an EA. Again, we provide a recommended format on how to document the environmental review record for this level of environmental review. So this shows you a little snippet of the document. So again, provides the opportunity to demonstrate analysis of all of the different environmental factors, and then documenting the decision made once that analysis is done, referring to any type of additional supporting documentation, maps, photos, consultation with other federal agencies. All of that must be articulated and documented within the environmental review record here. DHHL would also need to make a finding once the environmental analysis is complete, and it would be either a finding of no significant impact or a finding of significant impact. So these are the two findings, the options of findings. So if it's a finding of no significant impact, that means the project will not result in a significant impact on the quality of the human environment or result in non-compliance with the related federal laws and authorities. So that's what we're striving for. We're hoping, right, that all projects have a finding of no significant impact. But if after going through the environmental analysis, the determination is there is a finding of significant impact where the project may significantly affect the environment or result in non-compliance with the related federal laws and authorities, then we need to take a pause here and determine whether, or DHHL may want to take a pause and determine whether they want to continue moving forward with this project or not, or at least with use of NHHBG funds. And of course, my office and myself were always available to provide technical assistance whenever DHHL needs it at any point within the environmental review process. So again, we provide a format for the required documentation of the ERR. DHHL would need to record their determination and any conditions for approval. In many instances, the EA will have mitigation measures that are identified in order to move forward with the project. So those mitigation measures must be identified. Those mitigation measures must be carried out. So that would also need to be documented in the environmental review record. If carrying out these mitigation measures requires adding conditions into contracts that result in committing funds to this project. So any type of contracts that DHHL may have for a developer in order to implement the project, some of those mitigation measures may be provisions put into those contracts. So again, all of that must be articulated and identified in the environmental review record to demonstrate compliance. Okay. So this would be the section of the documentation where we allow DHHL to identify any mitigation measures, and then also to indicate their determination of either a FONSI, finding of no significant impact, or otherwise. And then where the preparer would sign the documentation, and then of course a place for the certifying officer to sign the environmental review record. Okay, so the environmental assessment does require that DHHL do a public notification. And hopefully, right, it'll be a FONSI that's achieved as part of the analysis. And so a combined notice of FONSI and notice of intent to request release of funds must be published before DHHL submits the request for release of funds to HUD. So a copy of that notice, any public comments that DHHL may receive as part of that notice of publication must also be documented in the environmental review record, and then DHHL's response to any of those comments must also be documented in the environmental review record. And then of course, once the request for release of funds is submitted and HUD authorizes the release of funds, these would all be documented in the environmental review record as well. And then once, of course, HUD authorizes the release of funds, then DHHL may proceed with committing funds to implement the project. Okay. Now, the environmental impact statement, as I mentioned, is the highest level of environmental review under the federal regulation. It's the most involved level of environmental review, and DHHL would have to perform an EIS for a project that would potentially have significant impact on the human environment, or if it's of a certain size that involves 2,500 or more housing units, whether it's acquisition, construction, demolition, rehabilitation. So in my experience, EISs are extremely rare for HUD-funded projects. So I'm not going to spend too much time describing this particular level of environmental review, but I think it's just helpful for folks to know that it's there. It's an option if it's needed. If DHHL were to ever take on such a project, then we'll discuss further. But so far, we have not had that privilege to explore this. So we'll go ahead and breeze through the next few slides on the EIS. Okay, so this next section, I'm going to cover the publication requirements and the request for release of funds. So I mentioned to you, right, there are certain levels of environmental review that requires DHHL to submit a request for release of funds to HUD. So here are some terms or acronyms that I want to define first before we get into the next few slides. So the NOI or ROF means Notice of Intent to Request Release of Funds. RROF is the request for release of funds. ROF is release of funds. FONSI, finding of no significant impact. And then of course, FONSI / NOI RROF is that combined notice of finding of no significant impact and the notice of intent to request release of funds. And then of course, HUD provides recommended formats for creating each of these notices, right? So at a minimum, public notices must be published in a newspaper of general circulation in the affected community where that project is located. If not published in the newspaper, then that public notice must be posted, prominently displayed somewhere in a public building. Such examples that regulation identifies would be like a local post office within the project area. In addition, right, to either being published in the newspaper or posted somewhere in the community, the notice must also be disseminated to all interested parties. So when we say disseminate notices to interested parties and agencies, these would be individuals and groups who are known to be interested in the activities of this project. We should always include Native Hawaiian organizations for all of DHHL's projects. So on the U.S. Department of Interior website, they do have a link where they have a list of Native Hawaiian organizations. So it would be up to DHHL to determine from that list who might be interested individuals or parties that they may want to include and send notices out to for any particular project they're working on. The notice should be disseminated to the local news media, appropriate local, state, and federal agencies, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Regional Office, and there is a specific email address provided. And so when disseminating the notice to the EPA Regional Office, please ensure to send it directly to that email address. They've given us specific instructions on that. And then, of course, the notice should also be sent to the HUD Honolulu office, and I've provided our mailing address there. It must be documented in the ERR how and to whom the notice was dispersed. So when are public notices required? The categorical exclusion subject to 58.5, when they do not convert to an exempt activity, that level of environmental review requires a notice of intent to request release of funds. So before DHHL actually submits the request for release of funds to HUD, they must issue a public notice to inform the public that they have this intent to request funds from HUD to do this project. And so that would be an opportunity for the public to be involved in the decision-making and process. Okay, so that's the purpose of that. And then of course, it gives opportunity for the public to issue comments or either for or against the project, and also to submit objections to HUD once that request for release of funds is submitted to HUD. Okay. So again, we provide a recommended format on how to write up that notice of intent to request release of funds. There is a minimum period for allowing public comment to the notice of intent to request release of funds. When that notice is published in the newspaper, it's a minimum of 7 days to allow public comment. If not published in the newspaper and that notice is only made available, posted in a public area, then DHHL must allow a minimum of 10 days for public comment. And the first day of the public comment period begins the day after the notice is either published or posted. The combined notice of FONSI and notice of intent to request release of funds must clearly indicate the intended purpose of that notice, that it satisfies two separate procedural requirements. The notice to the public that the DHHL has determined this project will have no significant impact on the environment. And then the other part of the notice is letting the public know that DHHL intends to request a release of funds from HUD. And then of course, giving the public opportunity to submit comments. And so we do provide the recommended format on how to write up this notice. For this combined notice of FONSI and notice of intent to request release of funds, DHHL must allow a minimum of 15 calendar days for public comment when published in the newspaper. If not published and posted, then they must allow a minimum of 18 calendar days for public comment. If there are Notices for environmental assessments. Um, there could be time delays for exceptional circumstances related to these projects. Then in that case, the responsible entity or DHHL must make the FONSI available for public comment for 30 days before submitting the request for release of funds to HUD. So if DHHO feels that there may be some type of, based on experience, maybe some type of controversy or strong feelings and opinions related to a particular project. Remember the time periods that I mentioned earlier? Those are all minimums. But whenever DHHL feels there may be exceptional circumstances related to a project, DHHL can always allow additional time for the public to respond and provide comment. And so the DHHL could allow 30 days for public comment to address any considerable interest or controversy concerning a particular project. Okay. And then this gives information about the different types of notices that would be required if carrying out an environmental impact statement. So as you can see from the outline, there are actually additional notices that would be required. There would even be a requirement to do some publication in the Federal Register when carrying out an environmental impact statement. So clearly this is a higher level of environmental review, much more time and effort and documentation involved to carry this out. Now, when receiving comments from the public on any notifications that are published, DHHL should plan its internal procedures on how it will conduct or address any public comments that are received. Ensure availability. DHHL must ensure that they make their environmental review record available to the public. So whenever DHHL publishes their notice of intent to request release of funds, as I mentioned, it gives the public opportunity, right, to be involved in the decision-making process. So during that period, that 7 or 15-day period of the public notice, DHHL is making their environmental review available to the public for public review, gives the public opportunity to provide comment. And so DHHL must ensure that they have their own internal process and procedures on how they're going to handle that whenever the public does respond and requests, to review the ERR or they submit comments. So DHHL must review and consider any comments that are received. If warranted, DHHL would have to carry out additional investigation if the public comments, warrant it. DHHL must respond to all comments that are received and include the comments and their response to those comments in the environmental review record. So once that process is complete, if there were no comments, then DHHL can quickly move forward to do the request for release of funds to HUD. If there were public comments and they've all been addressed and documented in the ERR, then DHHL can submit the request for release of funds to HUD. So DHHL must complete this particular form. It's called a HUD 7015.15. It's DHHL's request for release of funds to HUD and certification to HUD that DHHL has carried out its environmental review responsibilities for this project. So DHHL is identifying the project, it's describing the project, identifying the amount of funds it's requesting HUD to release and authorize DHHL to use in order to commit to this project and implement this project. Once DHHL receives the request for release of funds from DHHL, now HUD will wait a minimum of 15 calendar days to give the public opportunity to submit objections to DHHL's request for release of funds. Now, those objections can only be based on certain circumstances to halt the process, right? So if it's outside of those circumstances that are identified within the public notice that DHHL issued when it issued its notice of intent to request release of funds, right? So if the public objects based on those qualified circumstances, then it will delay the process a bit. If there are no comments or the comments are outside of the warranted circumstances, then HUD will proceed with processing the request for release of funds and issue what's called an authority to use grant funds. DHHL can either submit the request for release of funds in hard copy or through an environmental online system that HUD has. It's called HEROES, the HUD Environmental Review Online System. So again, the request for release of funds can be submitted in hard copy or electronically via HEROES. And then HUD will respond in whichever way DHHL submitted the request. Okay. So again, HUD must wait out the 15-day public objection period. So on day 16, we can already start processing the release of funds if there were no objections. These would be some of the reasons why HUD wouldn't approve the release of funds, because either DHHL or one of its participants didn't comply with some of the requirements, or the request for release of funds and certification is inaccurate. Maybe the form is incomplete, a signature is missing, or it's brought to HUD's knowledge by some other public or federal agency that one of the steps that DHHL certified to was not actually complete. So those would all be some of the reasons why the release of funds might not be approved. Okay. I'm sorry, this just kind of repeats some of the reasons why we would not approve the release of funds. And so once we do authorize the release of funds, we will issue it on this form HUD 7015.16. We will notify DHHL, and then from that point, DHHL may proceed with committing funds for the project. Again, only after HUD approves the release of funds. And then DHHL will notify if they're working with any sub-recipients, contractors, service providers who are helping DHHL to implement the project. From that point forward, DHHL can notify their program participants that it's okay to move forward. They will maintain contact with the participants throughout the environmental review process and inform them when it's okay to start committing funds and implementing the project. Are we doing okay on time, Malia? Okay, great. The next few slides will just talk about some other environmental guidance. So as I mentioned, we do have a website we call HUD Exchange, and we do have a particular page on our HUD Exchange website that covers environmental review. And I really love this website because it has so many tools and resources available to DHHL and its environmental consultants. It provides the resources to learn more about all of the environmental factors that must be evaluated to complete a federal environmental review under HUD regulations. So it provides training in that sense. It provides self-paced webinars to learn more, to increase capacity about the requirements under the Part 58 environmental review. It also has all of the HUD recommended formats that I've discussed in the previous slides. And so we try to provide as many resources as possible to make it as user-friendly as possible to implement the requirements, to document the environmental review. So that's where you'll find all of this information on this website, and also to gain access to the HUD environmental review online system. Okay. These are just some approximate timeframes for completing each level of environmental review. Maybe I should say it's a minimum. Malia is smiling. So for the lowest level of environmental review, or the quickest or the less administrative burden one, is the level of environmental review for exempt activities and for categorically excluded, not subject to activities. Approximate time frame, maybe an hour or so to complete the form. That's accurate? Okay, good. To complete the form, document your ERR, you're good to go. The next higher level of environmental review is a categorically excluded subject to the other federal laws and authorities at 58.5. Takes approximately 30 to 90 days, maybe a little more, depending. Really, I think what the time factor relies on is whether there's consultation involved with other agencies like state historic preservation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So it kind of depends, right, on how quick the other agencies respond to what you're requesting as far as consultation or um, additional information or documentation. Again, approximately 30 to 90 days. And then to complete the environmental assessment, approximately 45 days to a year or more. And then the EIS could take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. So hopefully we never have to deal with an EIS, right? But basically, just to give folks an idea of about how long it takes to comply, depending on the level of environmental review. And so my recommendation is as soon as DHHL even thinks they might use NHHBG funds for a particular project, go ahead and get started on your environmental review process. The sooner you start, hopefully the quicker you'll be able to complete, and then there will be less of a delay to start committing funds to the project and implement the project. Because remember what I said, the environmental review and the authority of to use funds must be done before any funds are committed, whether it's HUD funds or other funds. Okay, so again, my strong recommendation. NHHBG funds can be used to pay for conducting the environmental review tasks. NHHBG funds are available to DHHL upon execution of the grant agreement between HUD and DHHL. But again, based on what I've explained to you so far, there are certain requirements and steps that must be taken first, right, before the funds can be committed to any type of expenditure. So again, don't forget to document the ERR. It is possible to use grant funds from one grant cycle to conduct an ERR or environmental review for projects that will actually be funded in future years. So typically the way it works is Congress will appropriate funds on a yearly basis. And once we get through the process for DHHO to receive the grant funds from HUD, HUD will execute a grant agreement for that fiscal year appropriation. Next year, we'll go through the same process. So it's very common for DHHO to have anywhere from 4, 5, sometimes 6 grant agreements that are open at one time. So that's what we're talking about when we say using funds from one grant cycle to implement a project that may be implemented later on. Okay. So when projects are funded from multiple HUD sources, in other words, you're going to use NHHBG funds with other HUD program funding, the responsible entity must complete the environmental review concerning all project activities connected to that project. Public notices should identify all sources of HUD program funds that will be used in the project. And the request for release of funds that is submitted to HUD must identify all sources of HUD program funds. So we want to make sure that we take care of complying with all the different HUD program requirements as concisely as possible. The approval must be received from HUD on all sources of its program funds before project commitments and expenditures can be made. Okay. You might have projects that are funded from multiple federal sources, HUD and non-HUD funds. DHHL may reference another entity's environmental review for documentation. So if there was an environmental review that has already been completed to comply with another federal program, it is possible for DHHL to utilize information from that other environmental review to comply with the HUD environmental review requirements. But DHHL should ensure that the information is current and relevant to the project. DHHL could adopt the environmental review documentation from another source, but augment it with any documentation to comply with the specific Part 58 environmental review requirements. So that's another option. A DHHL must still independently evaluate the information, though, from that other environmental review and take responsibility for that information to ensure that it's, for the scope and content, to ensure that DHHL is documenting their environmental review accordingly to comply with all of the Part 58 requirements. It's okay for DHHL to work with the other federal agency to establish either a lead or cooperating partnership. And then DHHL, of course, must still comply with all of the public notice requirements under Part 58. Okay, so heading towards a wrap up of my presentation, I just wanted to briefly go over and mention some key stumbling points and best practices that we've experienced in the past, not necessarily with DHHL, but just HUD overall in general. So a very big stumbling point is where project funds are obligated or expended prior to the request for release of funds and certification being submitted and approved by HUD. I can't stress that anymore. This is a really big one. So we want to make sure that there is no violation, no statutory violation of MEPA, and to ensure that the authority to use funds is received before committing and contracting any funds for a project. Okay. Another stumbling point is that public notices do not contain all of the required information, or it contains incorrect information. So again, we provide HUD recommended formats for writing up the notices that will be published. So if DHHL and their consultants are following the HUD recommended formats, you should be in really good shape with this. Okay. Another stumbling point is the environmental review does not contain all of the required documentation, or it contains incorrect information. Okay, so just want to make sure that you're following all of the HUD recommended formats for complying with the appropriate level of environmental review. By following the HUD formats, or even by entering the environmental review itself in the HUD environmental review online system. It holds your hand and walks you through every single step of the process to try to alleviate any missteps or leading to not including enough information to document the ERR. Another key stumbling point is the failure to aggregate activities. So we want to make sure that our responsible entities aggregate accordingly and not try to circumvent the requirements by separating your project out when really it should be combined and evaluated as one whole project. Another stumbling point is the timing of public notices, or in the request for release of funds, the timing is incorrect, or relying solely on a consultant to carry out really what is DHHL's responsibility. So again, I'm not saying that this is something that DHHL does, but using DHHL as an example to explain this key stumbling point. So DHHL actually, in my opinion, does a really good job. They've increased their capacity over the recent years. And as far as working with their consultants, they work very closely with the consultants, and DHHL, I feel, does a good job of making sure that even though the consultant is contracted to do certain parts of the environmental review, that DHHL is overseeing that and staying involved in the process. Because ultimately, again, right, DHHL is the responsible entity. So that Kuleana falls on DHHL to ensure, right, that all of the requirements are met and everything is documented accordingly. And some best practices is staff stability to gather and retain environmental knowledge and skills. As I mentioned, DHHL has done a really good job in this area in increasing its capacity to make sure that it's carrying out this responsibility well. And if using a consultant through review, do a thorough review of the consultant's background prior to hiring. So again, I'm sure that this is something that DHHO does in its due diligence when it's procuring environmental review consultants. Some other best practices is to stay involved in the entire environmental review process from start to finish. Maybe even to develop an environmental database. So there are these environmental factors that must be reviewed, which involve specific agencies, like I mentioned, the State Historic Preservation Division, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So there are set agencies and entities that must be partnered with to complete the environmental review. So sometimes it's helpful to create a database of repeat points of contact, repeat websites that may have a library of information that DHHL often will refer to. Checking for whether we have any wild and scenic rivers in Hawaii. There's a certain database for that. There's a certain database for the wetlands inventory. So things like that are best practices that could be developed for DHHL as well as its consultants to help make this as more less administrative, as a less of a burden administratively to complete the environmental review. Okay. Some other best practices, using a digital camera to document on-site conditions. When you have to work with other agencies, start early, start talking with them, get them involved early in the process, maintain that contact list that I referred to establish that rapport so it's easy to communicate with them, and then ensure that you will meet each agency's requirements in a single review so that you don't have to keep going back to reconnect with them if you don't have to. Right? All suggested best practices. Again, some final thoughts. That number one bullet, something I've mentioned throughout the presentation. So that's my mantra. Don't obligate or expend funds prior to completing the entire environmental review process. The environmental review record, document, document, document. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I'm here, I'm available. I have subject matter experts that I have on my colleague staff that I can also tap into. So please reach out to HUD whenever there are questions or requests for assistance with regard to doing the environmental review. The environmental review does seem daunting. It is a big responsibility, but I'm hoping that with some of the information that I've shared, some of the additional tools and resources and training that HUD makes available, I'm hoping that it will make this a process that is not as intimidating as it may sound and seem. So, mahalo. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask at this time? Yes. Aloha.
Sorry, here we go. Wanted to ask about our individual ERRs that we have for our projects. That just to clarify, that sometimes I come across families that are in the ERR process and they are thinking about doing things themselves during the project. It is my understanding that no activity can happen during the ERR process on the part of the recipient, the family. Is this correct?
Yes. So I talked about the project scope, right? So the beginning of the environmental review process is to identify the project, the scope of the project. So all of the activities that will be included in the project. And I believe what Aloha is referring to is, as an example, and if I may, correct me if I'm wrong, as an example, DHHL has a homeowner financing program that uses NHHBG funds to provide financing to individual Native Hawaiian families to either construct a new home or to demolish, rebuild a home, or to do home rehabilitation on an existing home. So you're correct, Aloha, in that once the ERR, the environmental review process starts, that process must be completed before any funds can be committed to carry out that project or before any activity is done to carry out that project. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Because
Okay.
sometimes I came across a family who they have money, they want to do simple things during. So recently, I just advised them. It is my understanding that this type of activity cannot go on since your ERR has already started.
That's correct, yes. And the purpose, the reason why is because we want to evaluate all of the potential environmental impacts, right? That could result as a result of using the NHHBG funds or the homeowner's own funds, right? Because we talked about projects that involve both NHHBG funds and other funding sources. And so because we have to aggregate all of the activities for that one complete project, we must complete the environmental review process before any funds are committed and any activity is carried out. Okay.
Okay, so my next one, I think the last time you guys did a presentation, just want to re-clarify about specifically for activities that can happen while the ERR is going on, such as the ability for people to put together, such as plans, permitting, these type of activities. Just wanted to make sure that this is definitely activities that can happen during the ERR process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. That again is correct, where NHHBG funds can be used to carry out exempt activities, and so the action of actually carrying out the environmental review can be done. So those activities related to carrying out the environmental review can be done. And Malia, I'm going to let you chime in here to help me because I'm not quite sure exactly what is DHHL's process in addressing that. So I'll let you please feel free to interject.
So we do have, we do have a separate ERR that covers administrative processes. So permitting falls into that, developing plans, that also falls into that. So although those can be integrated into the environmental review for that particular project, we also have it as a separate ERR that is already completed. So those can be done before the ERR is complete because we cover those in another environmental review.
Perfect.
I'm going to ask the people that are online, if you would like to ask a question. I'm going to try to go back and forth between our in-person and those online. Just raise your hand and then we'll let you know to unmute your mic. So do we have anybody online? If not, I'm going to hand it over to Lehua. She has a question.
Well, I think people can learn from mistakes as well as doing things well. You spoke about the violation that had occurred previously. Do you mind sharing some just so that we can understand what happened in the past and how we want to avoid that ever happening in the future?
Okay, sure. So there's a project. Is it okay for me to identify the project? Okay. So on the Big Island, there's a project called Lalamilo, and this project is one of those that was uh, organized under a multi-year aggregation, right? Very typical for DHHL's larger housing development projects. There so there was a phase 1 and phase 2 identified in this project. My understanding is DHHL completed an environmental assessment that covered all of the activities, right, to build out phase 1 and phase 2 of this housing project. When it came time, though, for DHHL to submit the request for release of funds to HUD, DHHL did submit a request for release of funds, but only to release funds to carry out activities in phase 1 of the project. Typically, DHHL would request a release of funds for the entire project, not parcel it out that way. So I really feel that this was just sort of a administrative error. It really wasn't done intentionally. But what happened was DHHL submitted the request for release of funds for X amount of dollars of NHHBG funds to move forward with the development in phase 1 of the project. Then DHHL, after that was done, DHHL moved forward and started committing funds and developing phase 2 of the project, but did not submit a request for release of funds, authority to use funds to do the work in phase 2 of the project. And so when it was, by the time I was aware of what was going on, the contracts were already executed, work was being carried out to do the work in phase 2, but there was no accompanying HUD authority to use those funds. So that was a statutory violation. To make things a little more, what was more complicated about that project is that the project is also located in the former Waikoloa maneuver area, a formerly used defense site. And it was also around that same time that I noticed that there was that statutory violation for the release of funds. It was also around that same time that it was brought to my attention of the circumstances of potential unexploded ordnance contamination that was not fully remediated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so what that pointed out was that the environmental assessment that DHHL had completed for that project was not done in adequate compliance, right? It was actually out of compliance with the environmental review under Part 58. The UXO, the unexploded ordnance contamination, falls under toxic contamination, right? A factor that must be reviewed as part of the environmental analysis. And so being that that factor was also not fully reviewed and addressed before determining that DHHL had complied with all of the environmental review requirements was also another problem with the project. So it was multiple circumstances related to that project, but in the very end, it ended up being that that project was determined ineligible for NHHBG assistance. And so that is the status of that project at this point. But from that point to now, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has made progress in some of its remediation of the UXO contamination. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has provided documentation to the Hawaii State Department of Health, which is the regulatory authority over U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with regard to site contamination. And the State Hawaii Department of Health has issued a conditional no further action letter that covers, I want to say, 180 acres of the Lalamilo parcel. So a portion of that Lalamilo parcel has demonstrated compliance to HUD's mitigation requirements with regard to remediating the UXO contamination. But because of the issue with the statutory violation for NHHBG funds, no, DHHL will not be using NHHBG funds in that project, but that area of the Lalamilo parcel that is covered by this conditional no further action letter that the Department of Health issued makes that area available for doing Section 184A loans, which is the other program that I administer for HUD. And what it does is it makes mortgage loans available to Native Hawaiian families on Hawaiian homelands. And so that area is now opened up for doing 184A financing. But sorry, that was kind of a long explanation and history to that project, but that is the example that I believe Lehua wanted me to share.
Yeah, I think it can be helpful, that's why, so that we learn from our mistakes as well.
Mhm.
I know you did best practices, but I know you've also done monitoring of DHHL and environmental is one area. From those monitoring activities, was there anything you wanted to share or highlight that maybe was done and how we've addressed it, or anything that you think would be helpful?
Sure. So there's been a couple of monitorings that we've done of DHHL's environmental review records. One example is that one with regard to the UXO contamination, where the environmental analysis was not completely done because it didn't fully address that one contamination issue. So similar to that, there have been other, I'm going to say, examples of where the environmental review record was not fully documented, but DHHL was given the opportunity to go back and perform the necessary analysis or additional analysis or obtain the additional necessary documentation to satisfy that condition. And thus the environmental review was then considered complete after that. There was another example where the scope of a project was articulated, but the activities that were carried out did not quite match the project scope description. And so DHHL was given the opportunity to go back and rectify accordingly so that the environmental review record now describes and documents accurately the project activities for the project. So that's why there was some examples that I had listed on the slide for best practices, right? Make sure that the environmental review record is documented accurately, completely, and in alignment with the project. And following all of the HUD recommended formats or using our HEROES online system to perform the environmental review is also a very good best practice to ensure that steps are not missed or documentation is not missed in completing the analysis.
Do we have anybody online that has a question? Anybody else here have any questions?
Thank you. When mitigations or conditions are required, is there any type of mitigation monitoring and reporting program, sometimes called an MMRP, that is required? And are the agencies or essentially who would be in charge of ensuring that these conditions or mitigations are carried out, and how are those measured and reported?
I'm going to ask Malia to help me with that, because ultimately the short answer to the question is DHHL's responsibility.
Yeah, that's correct. It is DHHL's responsibility. So over the years, in part because of us learning how to do things differently, we now actually do a mitigation plan, and that gets sent out to all of the entities that would be involved in helping comply with those mitigations. We also use heroes, and so that's part of the place that we document it. But a lot of the environmental compliance requirements have to do with timing of when we do work, and how things are identified within the plans that get submitted to the counties for permitting. So that's one of the big areas that once we make sure that those are in the plans, and then the contractor is then obligated to meet all the requirements that are included in the plans that go through permitting. And when we're doing inspections, those are the things that are evaluated. So we do periodic inspections during the construction phases, and so then those get included in our kind of response to the mitigations. The other mitigations that happen sometimes happen before we start construction. So these are typically for our smaller individual projects. So the ones where we're doing rehab on an existing house, or maybe we're doing a demolition. So those have to do with hazard abatement. So those happen before actually the construction starts. And so we've done it a variety of different ways. Sometimes DHHL has held on to doing the abatement on our own, and so we hire the contractor directly. But we've also done it the other way, where that's part of the construction project, where that hazard abatement gets done prior. And then that all gets documented in HEROES. Does that help answer your question?
I guess one extension of that question might also just be, to what extent are the mitigations and conditions required to be tracked and reported as part of the EA approval? Or I guess in the instance of a categorical exclusion in which mitigations are required?
Yeah, so once we're done with the environmental review record, so we do use HEROES as our kind of repository for everything. There is a section actually that is for mitigations, and so that's where we're reporting all the information, is in HEROES. But in our older ones, then we're keeping it in a hard copy file. Any other questions in the room? I don't see.
Hi, aloha.
Aloha.
Question, if NHHBG funds are used for pre-construction and or construction on a project, is the project limited to beneficiaries that qualify or that meet the NHHBG qualifications, or can it serve people outside of that income eligibility?
So aloha Gaitin, I know you're from Nakua Development. I'm not sure if you're talking about, say, PMKK, Pi'ilani Mai Ke Kai on Kauai. I know you folks have a couple projects there. So that ERR that DHHL completed was for the entire area. There are some families there who may be over income, and so they would not utilize NHHBG funds, but the environmental review was done for the entire area. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, or if you have another example.
Yeah, no, another example, if it's a new project and we're interested in using the HUD funding for pre-construction or construction, is that project limited to just only helping out beneficiaries that are in the income eligibility qualifications for NHHBG, or if people fall outside of that, are they able to be basically within the project, or can they
Okay, so
get
is this the
yeah.
Honoka'a development?
No particular,
specific one.
yeah, no specific one. Just, I mean, if we have a project and we're, interested in, from a development standpoint, in using the HASDA funds for pre-construction for the project as a whole, or construction as, or whether that's infrastructure or vertical, does that limit the beneficiaries that we can serve, or can everyone on the list be served?
Okay, so how we've handled this in the past, I can just share how we've done. So like, for example, in East Kapolei, we've provided funding for infrastructure as an example. Whatever percentage of NHHBG funds that are used, whether it's pre-construction or construction, that percentage of the total development costs should go towards income eligible families. So I'm just gonna throw out round numbers. So if $10 million is the total cost and NHHBG contributes $1 million, then 10% of the units that will be developed for this $10 million project should go towards NHHBG income eligible families. I will turn to Claudine if that, and she's nodding her head, but I don't know if you
Yes.
wanna add.
Okay, yeah, mahalo.
Do we have any others online? If you could raise your hand using the hand raising button, and then we can call on you. Okay, I'm going to say there are no more questions unless there's somebody else that is excited to ask another question. Oh, we got one more in the room. Hold on.
Actually, just asking to make sure that these presentations are all going to be posted and available so we can look at them later.
Yes, they will be. Do we have any others? Okay, I'm going to say if we can get back here, we'll take a break so that you can stretch, use the restroom. It looks like we're going to start. We'll start a little bit earlier than what's on the agenda. So if you can be back here at 11, so 13-minute break, something like that. Okay, so we'll see you soon.